Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the debate and Q&A after the Brutal Beauty film and video tour of the Czech and Slovak Embassies by Owen Hatherley, which was done as part of the London Festival of Architecture, together with the Czech and Slovak Embassies. I would like to ask today's participants to join me on the screen. Owen Hatherley, Rostislav, Švácha, and Irena Lehkoživová. There they are. Before I introduce them, I would just like to set down some ground rules. So we'll begin with a short discussion, and after that we'll open the floor to Q&As. However, because there's a lot of you, we won't be taking video questions, but if you want to ask a question, please write it in the chat, and I will note it, and then I will ask it on your behalf. So mics off, sound off for everyone but our participants, and please questions go to everyone in the chat. Also, thank you to the Czech Center as the organizer of this event. You know, we wouldn't be here without them, and they really do have a great selection of cultural programming during London Festival of Architecture, but also, you know, pertaining to other cultural events and exhibitions that they organize in London, but also in Czech centers across the world. So you've seen Owen, of course. He did the virtual tour of the Czech and Slovak Embassies. Owen is an author, an architecture critic, and he's written mainly about post-war architecture, both in Britain and in the Eastern Bloc. He's written about some of his books. He averages about one book a year, sometimes more. He's written The Ministry of Nostalgia, Landscapes of Communism, Trans-Europe Express, just to name some. Owen's joining us from London. And from Prague, we have Professor Rostislav Švácha, who is an architecture critic and historian at the Academy of Sciences in Prague. He specializes in modern and contemporary Czech architecture. And also we have Irena, Dr. Irena Lehkoživová, who's a Czech architecture historian based at the Archive of Fine Arts and Research Center in Prague. She's written about modern and contemporary Czech architecture, and has also written about, has contributed and co-edited a book about Panelaks, the Czechoslovak Plattenbau buildings. So welcome to the debate. Please turn on your mics, and I think we're just going to start off by talking about these buildings in the context of a built heritage from the socialist era. So, you know, what are the architects' attitudes towards this building, and also not just the Czech and Slovak embassies, but more broadly socialist architecture in general. So I'll ask Irena and Rostislav maybe to begin.
You want to start?
Yes, yeah. I think that situation for architecture of 60s and 70s is difficult now, because there is a differentiation between older generation, for instance, my generation, and younger generation. Older generation is connected this architecture with communist regime. And what is communist is ugly. Younger generation who was not living in under communism, I think, like this architecture. Of course, there is great problem of preservation of this architecture, because we have listed buildings, a lot of listed buildings from the first half of 20th century, but as to post-war architecture, only few buildings are listed. In Prague, for instance, about 12 or 13. It is few. And what is not listed is in a great danger.
But even, of course, just I will add, even the buildings listed as my, for example, are endangered because the owners want to rebuild them. Of course, we were talking about before this hotel in Brno, when from the 50s or early 60s, when the owners asked the state to cancel the preservation so that they can rebuild the hotel according to new design and so on. And the Ministry of Culture, I think, in this instance, did it. So.
And Owen, how would you say that kind of relates to a similar discourse about brutalism in the West? Obviously, you know, the regime in the West was democratic, but I think there's also this generational split about people viewing architecture from this era in very different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's in some ways, this is just a thing that's part of architectural history. You know, I was reading Kenneth Clarke's The Gothic Revival the other day for one reason or another, and it's written at a point in the 1920s when, like, you had to cringe to convince anyone that any Gothic Revival buildings were good. Like, it was incredibly difficult, and the whole book is them going like, "I know this is all terrible, but humour me." And you know, and it has these little additions from 20 years later in the footnotes. So he's just like, "Oh, now happily one can admit that St Pancras is good, now that people who remember St Pancras when it was built are no longer alive." And this is very much, you know, just sort of an inherent thing. I do think there's a politics to it, of course, because of the fact that in this particular case, the change in architectural style in the 1970s and 1980s all coincided with a change in politics. And that change, whether it's 1979 in the UK with Thatcher, or whether it's the kind of shock therapy that lots of Eastern Europe and Central Europe were subjected to in the 1990s, there is obviously a break. But this is a thing that just happens time and time and time again. It's just, you know, I'm, for one, I'm looking forward to being, you know, mocked for saying that the buildings of the last 15 years were terrible in 30 years' time. Like, it always happens. But I do think that, you know, that there's also always the problem of preserving relatively recent buildings, that developers tend to think that they're fair game. You know, they are always less well protected. They are, you know, and in this case, there's also a thing of them often just being on a different scale altogether to what was happening before. But to be honest, one of the things the sort of script that I kind of wrote for this, and that I sort of depart from in various points, but it's roughly what's there. I was very, very keen to stress the continuities between pre-war Czech and Slovak modernism and what was happening in the 60s. And the way that that was very much a kind of opening up, and this is something where there's not a British equivalent at all. It was about sort of reopening a connection that was broken in the war and also broken in Stalinism. So, you know, things like that sort of bizarre Stalinist hotel in the outskirts of Prague with the spire, and things like, you know, the Peruka district and Ostrava, and all of this kind of classicism that comes in. It's really a kind of break of all of that, and then sort of reconnecting with the 20s and 30s. And I wanted to stress that.
Yeah. of course, it's also notable to say that the Poruba district in Ostrava is also listed in itself.
I mean, it's fascinating architecture, but it's, you know, we don't have anything like that.
No, perhaps not. But I would maybe like to go back to Irena and Rostislav, and maybe just ask about, we saw some of the other, Owen mentioned some of the other embassies in the film, the Berlin one and the one in Stockholm. And I think from the Berlin one, there was this, again, this sense of, you know, almost a total work of art with the interiors, you know, very space age. And I'm just wondering whether you can tell us more about how that building fared, and also how these different embassies were, you know, that were built to represent the, I suppose, achievements of socialism in Czechoslovakia, you know, how they can still function as embassies of a slightly different democratic state.
Yeah, of course, like the embassy in London, of course, it's one of the great examples of Czech or Czechoslovak embassies at the time, built from the early 60s, let's say, to the 70s. We have, for example, the embassy in Brazil, designed also, or Jan Šrámek, one of the designer of the London embassy, collaborated on that building as well, which is also a very nice example of this late modernism architecture of the late 50s and early 60s. Then, of course, for example, architect Karel Filzák, who did also like several embassies in Cairo, in Dili, and a few others.
Genf.
Yeah, Genf. And then, of course, the United Nations Czechoslovak mission in Geneva, also designed by Filzák Šrámek, and then to the embassy in Berlin, which is now very famous one and even recognized by the city of Berlin, or at least by the monumental preservation department of the city of Berlin, who is taking actions to preserve the building and to list it. So
yes, but it is a problem of the Czech state, because Czech state don't want to list it. Understand me? Understand.
I suppose it's much easier to work with a building that isn't listed when doing renovations. I think that was quite interesting in the film. You see, especially in the Czech embassy, you really see the contrast between you know, the previous very tailored approach in terms of the furnishing, the artworks, and the kind of more modern, streamlined contractor way of doing things. What's your impression of that, Owen?
Yeah, don't put me on the spot on this. I'm not familiar enough with the interior of the Czech part of the embassy as it was before the renovation to make too much comment on that relative to what was there before. But I do think it's fair to say that a lot of that stuff is quite generic, and it's not. And if it's anything like the level of the quality of the finishes in the Slovak part that still survive, this would, I think that it's fair to say that was a mistake. You know, and I would be mortified to think that the Slovak half would be, you know, on the way to doing the same thing. And in many ways, you know, I kind of hope that one thing this can hopefully do is be like, don't take all of this out, you know, sort of gather some sort of like impetus of like, actually this stuff is valuable, and you know, a lot more than the than what you're likely to replace it with, which is going to be sort of standard products. But of course, the appeal of those standard products is that they're cheaper, it's easier to install them, and it's easier to replace them. So I obviously, understand why it happens, but
I think it's also important to note that the way that the Czech-Slovak embassy was built and then later split up is that, of course, the Slovak part was supposed to be the more kind of representational official bit where you would have visiting dignitaries, whereas the Czech one was the kind of office block, the residential block, the canteen. So I think there was probably a difference in terms of what was in them. And it is, to me, it's quite interesting that speaking from my own kind of limited experience of seeing post-war buildings in Slovakia, they've been, of course, a lot of them have completely been gutted, but the ones which haven't survived through almost institutional neglect. So like the Slovak radio building has all the original interiors. But of course, that's only because the state literally can't even afford to throw those out, and they don't even want to keep the building. So that's again something quite interesting to see how the two different countries, have the heritage from the same era and kind of work with it in different ways. But one thing that we haven't maybe touched upon was, you have these embassies which are very which are supposed to kind of represent the country and its achievements. But then once the regime changes, how did that split happen? So for instance, in London, they managed to split the Czech and Slovak embassy, but maybe in some other countries, obviously, each country built their new embassy. So can you maybe you, Irena and Rostislav, maybe you know a bit more about this?
O tom dělení?
No.
Some embassies are area of několika several buildings. For instance, embassy in Brazil, in Delhi, in Cairo, and so on. And it is possible to split it. But problem is when embassy is only one building.
Yes.
As in Berlin, it is impossible. It is impossible. We know exactly situation of all embassies, but for instance, in Brazil, it was split between Bohemia and Slovakia.
What is because what is of course then let's say quite difficult is when you have this building split into two countries, so it's like one whole. So then the question is how to approach this now. If for example, if you want to renovate it, so then each country organize their own renovation, so it's not like coordinated for some, for example, and so on. So then it can end up that the whole the buildings are destroyed or have like a different appearance then. So that it's I don't know if like that's the case, but the embassy in Brazil, Rostislav mentioned, for example, the Czech part now. The Czech part was reconstructed in 2009, 2010, very precisely with done by the daughter of Jan Šrámek, who's also architect. So this building is very much preserved in original state, but I have no idea, for example, about the second building, which is now Slovak part, Slovak embassy. So I have like, for example, I don't know if they had the same attitude to invite like good architects and to do good preservation and good reconstruction.
Yeah. And I think that maybe we'll go to audience questions soon. So please, everyone in the chat, please send your questions. I will see them. But I have one last question, which is maybe, I think Owen touched on this, which was really looking for this continuity between, you know, the pre-war architecture. So, you know, the sort of famous Czech modernism, and then you obviously the post-war architecture. You know, you could sort of roughly divide it into the Stalinist architecture, and then, but of course, once things became a bit more free in the creative era, you had this kind of blossoming with Brussels and with these embassies, and now with contemporary architecture. So what are still, and I think Owen picked on surrealism as a common thread that connected the pre-war and the post-war architecture, but what about now? Do we still see some surrealism or other common threads from you know, the modernism of the 20s and the 30s, or the sort of brutalism and state architecture of the 60s and the 70s in contemporary Czech work?
Yes, as I understand, glassworks by Roubíček look like surrealist sculptures. Yeah, yes, this. But I think it is very interesting idea, but I'm not sure. It is true that we had very strong surrealist movement in 1930s. A group of surrealists in Prague, invitation of André Breton to Prague with famous lectures by Breton. And also discussion about relation of architecture, it means functionalist architecture and surrealism. Surrealist arguments in this discussion. It is especially a case of Karel Tajge, but also another architect, Jiří Kroha. He wrote in 1938 article Surrealism in Us. A functionalist architect wrote article Surrealism in Us. But I think that it is not obvious in architectural form. I don't know some surrealist architecture, you know. And in any case, it was disrupted. You know, this movement was disrupted in 1950s. You know. As to Roubíček, I like it. I like it. This free form of his glassworks. But I think that it is more expression of abstract art, abstractivism in art, not surrealism. Yes, to me.
But do you see some? Maybe Owen, you can comment on that later. But do you see some threads from architecture of the 20s and the 30s, or the 60s and the 70s that are present in contemporary Czech architecture?
What's all?
Well, but I don't think that it's maybe too obvious now, because of course maybe you can find some traces, let's say, of functionalism of this tradition in Czech architecture. But the average Czech architecture is globalized as everywhere.
Yeah.
But of course, in this relationship between architecture between the wars and late architecture later in the 80s, 90s, of course, there was after 1989 a big, let's say, return to the functionalist architecture, which was seen, as Rostislav described in many of his articles and books, as architecture, like democratic architecture representing the state which ceased to exist in 1939 or let's say 1948 after the communist takeover. So in the 80s and 90s, there was a strong movement of this like new functionalism, which where you can trace really more formal inspiration than let's say intellectual or theoretical, I would say. But many architects already in the 80s were thinking about these novo functionalismus, new functionalism, which maybe in this context you can also see is, or as sometimes I see as a kind of like postmodernism in a Czech context, this return to new something from the history. But of course, in this case, it was returned to the idea also of the strong functionalist tradition in Prague, in Brno, or elsewhere in the Czech Republic.
Yes, of course, it's question whether it is a result of some tradition of functionalism or influence of some American architects like Richard Meyer.
Yeah. Owen, do you have anything you would like to add, maybe?
Sure. I mean, in terms of contemporary Czech and Slovak architecture, I can't say. I mean, I echo the thing about it being very globalized. A lot of the, obviously, you know, of the capitals, Bratislava has vastly more new buildings than in the center, and they tend to be mediocre. So I can't really say. I mean, the interesting thing with something like this, in a way, is the fact that it's a globalized building and it isn't. You know, it's a sort of return, like all of the kind of post-expo stuff. It's a return to being in a dialogue with the rest of the world, or the rest of the world apart from the Soviet Union in architecture, because of course the Stalinist period was you know, it was under the influence of some other countries, but you know, we know which they were. So, you know, it obviously, you know, looking at it, you can see that, you know, this comes from, as mentioned, Louis Kahn. You know, you can see the influence of Le Corbusier. You know, you can kind of go through and kind of spot the, you know, bits from Paul Rudolph, etc., etc. You know, in many ways, the thing that then comes through as distinctive is actually the applied art. You know, and is the work by Rubacek and Kolibal and so on, and is the fact that there is this, and I think Rostislav is right that it's not strictly surrealist. I'm not going to contest this point. I think it's true. But what I think is surrealist, not in the sense of like, you know, card-carrying member of the surrealist movement, but in the sense of a surrealist thing, if you get me, is the juxtaposition. So is the way that, you know, those sort of very biomorphic chandeliers kind of erupt out of this, you know, kind of otherwise quite sort of severe building. A similar point with the way Kolibal's relief on the street facade and then on the interior have these kind of very, very different faces, and are very much kind of intended to be a sort of contrapuntal and dialectical kind of like, you know, interaction with the building in a way that it's not, oh, we have a modern building, we have a modern sculpture. Instead, it's a kind of like, we have the sculpture which works a bit in a quite sort of strange and jarring way. And I think those were the things that often kind of came in that would mark it out. And looking at it from my own perspective, when I saw it for the first time, it was those things that made me think, this is what makes me think of the buildings that I've seen in Bratislava and Ostrava and Prague and Brno and so on. It's this is what, you know, it's what made me think of things like the Ještěd TV tower in outside Liberec. So it was, you know, those were the things you wouldn't have got in another building by RMJM. You know, they weren't in mainstream British modernism, but they were in the Czech and Slovak modernism at the time. And that's the distinctive element, I think.
I'm looking at some of the questions from the audience. Some of them can be, you know, answered really quickly. So we're again back to the Velvet Divorce, and people are asking, how was it decided, you know, who got what? And somebody suggests all the properties were split in a 2-to-1 ratio. So the Czech building is twice as big as the Slovak building. Was that the case, Irena and Rostislav?
I think that can be the case. I'm not sure, so it's probably you can find it. I don't know it, but I would suppose the same answer, because like Czech Republic was twice the size of Slovakia, so I think it would perfectly fit the ratio 2-to-1.
Yes.
But
I'm happy to take that as an answer. Another question which is interesting is if any one of you knows more about the design process and whether there was a competition. And of course, you, Owen, mentioned that this was done by this collective of architects known as Beta Studio or Atelier.
Yes.
And of course, most buildings in Czechoslovakia were built by Stavo Projekt. I think in Slovakia for healthcare buildings, you had Zdravostav. So, you know, these were like massive state firms, but a lot of these were more boutique. So how did that work? Maybe that would be interesting to ask.
So that design process, of course.
Yes.
It is true that most of embassies from late 50s and 60s are result of competitions. Because authors like Jan Šrámek, Jan Bočan, or Karel Filzak were not prominent architects of regime. They were politically weird. For instance, Filzak was a member of bourgeois family from Bohemia, and Catholic, Christian. It was danger. It was danger for architect. So that it is a result of competitions. That's true that most of projects were worked in state design institutes. It means Stavo projects. But these architects go in different way. They use the better atmosphere of 1960s, this process of Prague Spring of 1968. They used better atmosphere and fund or based in 1966 independent studio in Prague. So that design of London embassy is result of this independent studio. Name was Spojené ateliéry, connected studios. And as to project or design of Czechoslovak embassy, Jan Šrámek was chief of studio, and Jan Bočan was working in London in the studio of Robert Matthew. So that Bočan was sitting in London and designed building project for building. To bylo rozdělení. It was splitting of roles of architects.
Yeah.
Jan Šrámek chief, and Jan Bočan is drawing. You know, Robert Matthew didn't believe that it is work of Czechoslovak architects. He said, I don't believe that it is Czech project. it is project of American architect. Really.
Yeah. Why was that? Was it because of the way it was designed, or the way it was built, or?
No, I think he didn't believe that Czech architect is able to do such beautiful building. It is not socialist. It is not socialist architecture.
Yeah, that's,
do you think, Owen, that there was? Yeah. Okay. No, you go. And then I'll ask.
Go, Owen.
No, I just thought maybe if you know anything about what people in Britain thought about architecture in socialist countries. I think there's often this idea that people in the, I don't know about what people in the 60s and 70s thought, but I know in the 80s, my parents' generation, they would, whenever they speak to someone, people would say, oh, it's everything so gray and drab. But was that also the impression in back then?
Yeah, I mean, the kind of idea, oh, this looks like Eastern Europe, is a thing that people say routinely about grey concrete buildings, which I think is partly due to the fact that in most TV dramas of the 70s and 80s, Eastern Europe was usually represented by Glasgow. So it's Glasgow's fault. But that's usually where they filmed, like Moscow or Prague or whatever, always Glasgow. Yes, and I think that I mean, there are connections between sort of Eastern and Western European architecture in that period, and some of them do go via Robert Matthew, and they're competing in lots of the rest of the world. Łukasz Danek's great book on architecture and the non-aligned movement, has things like Stavoj Project and, the Yugoslavs and Bulgaria and Romania and East Germany and Britain and RMJM and Maxwell Fry and Jane Drew all competing for who's going to design the new buildings in, Nigeria and in the Gulf and so forth. So they were kind of aware of what everyone was doing, but it wasn't taken very seriously. I mean, there is some interest in certain things. Like, I think actually Robert Matthews specifically wrote about Cheryomushki, the kind of first proper kind of modernist housing estate in Moscow after Stalin's death and after the shift back to modernism. But there was far, 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 far more interest in what happened in the 20s and 30s. And, the 60s and 70s were actually the period in which, after it kind of being kind of pushed under the carpet by people like Siegfried Gideon and Philip Johnson, it was the period of rediscovering the 20s and 30s radical architecture of the USSR, but also of Czechoslovakia, and discovering the fact that these people were very, very closely linked to left-wing movements, which they were. But the actual contemporary architecture, there's very, very little interest. And this particular building, I mean, it won awards because it was extraordinarily well made, but it's a building that in many ways just fade into the background quite a bit. Like the kind of the book on British architecture that mentions it in all of its editions is Christopher Woodward and Edward Jones's The Guide to the Architecture of London, which its first edition is early 80s. And they really like it because it's the kind of modern architecture they like to do. So, these are people that are involved in the design of Milton Keynes and so on. So it's, it's quite classically proportioned, it's quite regular, it's unspectacular, it doesn't have kind of great big mad cantilevers or funny shapes. It's a sort of sensible, sober, quite classical modern architecture. And that, I think, is why it was liked by who liked it, but also it just didn't cause a sensation, but it didn't horrify people either.
So you think maybe the Berlin embassy is more of a radical?
If you put that in the middle of West London, it would probably have been demolished by now.
So that's true that it is more expressive building in Berlin. As to me,
also a question. Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry. As to me, London, especially Slovak building, is almost classical. Looks like classical palace.
Yeah. No, I mean, the Slovak embassy might look like a classical palace, but when you go downstairs to get your passport, it is awful. And I don't recommend that experience for anyone. But another question, which was very quick, and this was something that Owen mentioned in the film, but I was also quite astounded to hear it, because in the Slovak embassy, you have this kind of like Rococo corner. Is that something that you, Rostislav and Irena, know to be like an original design intent, or was that later? Or for me, it is a very strange, and I have been inside the building, and I always wondered whether that was that.
I don't know, but I know that some another buildings by Karel Filsak, but also Jan Šrámek, is also old furniture.
Okay.
Because it seemed for them interesting, this contrast of modern architectural form and old furniture.
Okay.
It's a little bit surrealist.
Absolutely. I think it's very much a surrealist thing. It's also a thing that was just happening at the time, and I think Brutalists, it's something that Brutalists would do, but you wouldn't really get with your kind of international style modern architects. I mean, the Royal College of Physicians, you know, down the road in Regent's Park, has a quite similar juxtaposition of sort of odd bits of sort of Georgian furniture and old paintings and so forth with kind of rough concrete surfaces. It was a thing that was happening at the time.
Yeah.
I totally assume that it's original because I've seen similar stuff in buildings of that period in the region and in some cases.
Because we are now like or me working on one book about 11 houses by Karel Prager for 11 Czech artists, and many of them in this like very white modernist interior. Many of them had 19 Biedermeier furniture and so on. So I think it was, as Rostislav said, so this like feeling more like a homeliness, or this feeling. So even though that you are a contemporary like avant-garde artist, you still have this Baroque chair in your living room in this this precise concrete building.
And I think that's also carried, as you mentioned, Owen, that's also, I mean, something that was happening in London, but it kept on happening obviously later on. The other famous example is Lloyd's of London, where they, you know, have this, and also the Rothschild Bank by Owen, where they have this period room kind of in this deconstructed glass box in the city. So yeah, I guess surreal moments are alive and well, which is good. I'm going to see whether there are any more questions from in the chat. And I think that's it. I mean, there's a lot of questions as to, you know, the music in the video, which was excellently cut. But I think those have been answered by our wonderful Czech Center hosts. So unless you have any closing remarks, panel. Okay. Unless you have any closing remarks, please, you know, maybe say which part of the buildings you find most inspiring, or which aspect of the building. I think when I was in the preparations for this, and I haven't been in that part of the building, but the roof terrace is quite special because you can still feel the kind of original concrete mass there. But what would it be for our panelists?
Okay, I mean, I suppose I just feel that I've spent a lot of time picking up the Slovak embassy, and this might be unfair, but I would find it very difficult to choose between the Rupacek sculpture in the mezzanine and the Rococo bit We've already talked about the Rococo bit, so I think it's the kind of built-in chandelier which takes up most of that kind of huge double height mezzanine.
Yeah,
it's just one of the most extraordinary spaces I know of in a building of its period in London. It's just that kind of combination of sort of, you know, the kind of rigor of the rest of it, and then there's just explosion of bizarre creativity in the middle of it. I don't know any. There's very few things like that. I think it's extraordinary.
And Irena and Rostislav.
Well, unfortunately, I've never been inside, so I know both buildings only from outside when I visited London a few years ago. So
I know only Czech building.
Okay.
Yes.
But it may be.
But of course there is a big sculpture by Kolibal.
But maybe for people who are joining us today, do you know if the building it's sometimes open so that everyone interested can go inside? Because in Czech Republic there are this like open house festival.
Yes. So there is an open house festival, and I have seen the Slovak embassy as part of it. Sometimes, of course, the Czech Center has a small gallery in part of the Czech building that you can visit. And, you know, sometimes the Czech Center also organizes I think last time I was there, which was in the before times, was a discussion with Eva Jiřičná about her work, and it was downstairs in the cinema. So there are events that you can go to. Definitely, you can check the Czech Center website and see what's on. Hopefully, the restrictions will lift soon so that you can kind of see it in person. But I think the best bet would definitely be Open Day and Open House London, which I know both embassies do take part in, I think, or used to in the past. So I think that's it. It's been really lovely having our guests. Thank you very much, Owen and Irena and Rostislav. It's been lovely having you join in from London and Prague. Thank you, of course, to the Czech Center for organizing this and putting together the film. Thanks to London Festival of Architecture for hosting, for letting us be part of it, and thanks, of course, to the Czech and Slovak Embassies for letting us, I suppose, talk about them and letting Owen film there. So it's been great. Thank you very much. I will sign off. And so will our guests. So yeah, thanks for joining us again. Goodbye.
Well, thanks for inviting us and everyone participating in this event. Thanks.
Yeah, pleasure.